Hello, I'm Ciaran Walsh. Welcome to another episode of Prompt Corner. Today we're talking all things lighting and we have three guests, Johanna Town, Will Reynolds and Ali Hunter. So sit back and enjoy the chat.
Hello everybody, I'm Johanna Town, usually called Jo, and I'm a freelance lighting designer. I've worked in the industry for 40 years and have been freelance as a lighting designer for only the last 10 years. Before that I worked as heads of lighting in several of our regional and London theatres.
Perfect. And how about you, Will?
Hi, I'm Will Reynolds. I'm also a freelance lighting designer. I guess for about 15 years I've been freelance now. I actually trained as a set and costume designer at the Motley Design School. So I carry that on alongside lighting at the same time.
Brilliant. And Ali?
Hi, I'm Ali. I am also a lighting designer. Surprise, surprise. I've only been working in the industry for about 6 years. Previously, I studied languages, so I kind of went sideways into it. I mainly work in theatre and dance.
Perfect. Thank you for that. So I thought actually we might start by talking about that sort of beginning bits, because Will and Ali, you've both mentioned that you, so Ali, you started doing modern languages, and Will, did you study engineering at university maybe?
I did, yeah.
Another side thing. So perhaps, would you all be able to tell me about like what appeals to you about lighting design from the very off?
Well, I'm completely untrained. I knocked on a theatre door and said, how do I get a job in theatre, having been passionate about theatre and doing theatre in amateur dramatics from about the age of 10. And then when I had to decide what to do with my life, I couldn't imagine doing anything other than working in theatre, and lighting was the thing that had grabbed me. So I actually knocked on a door and got a job at the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester, and became an apprentice there for 2 years before moving on in my career. So I'm one of the few untrained lighting designers I know.
And how about you guys? What was the impetus to start with something different and to change into lighting design? Had it always been a passion? Was it always there for you?
So I did it as a hobby. So I started uni and thought I've always been interested in backstage, didn't know what any of the jobs were. So I started ASMing on student theatre, and then one night I found myself helping with the grid shift, which is moving all the things on the bars and reweighting them. So I did that, and then I follow spotted for a show because there were 6 stage managers and nobody to follow spot, and I just kind of got sucked into it. Before I knew it, I was lighting all of the musicals and all the tour shows at uni, and much like Joe, I just couldn't imagine doing any other job. I realised I did languages, loved studying them, but I'm awful at teaching. I didn't want to do a master's in any of the kind of translation stuff, so I just thought I'd give it a go. So I worked for a year at various theatres, did a few small shows, and then after I electrocuted myself at work, I thought I should get some training. So I did the postgraduate diploma at RADA. I kind of applied for it on a whim, got in, and basically got to play, which was great. So I sort of learned a lot of the design stuff before I actually trained, and then my training was very much technical. Well, the bit I got out of it was technical and time to play.
That's really interesting. So Will, you come from that then, the engineering sort of background, and both of you guys have spoken a little bit about that, the kind of connection between maybe like operation and design. Is that a fair way to split the two up, or that I'm presumably they're much more kind of connected than that? But what was it from that background?
My route through engineering actually it sounds a lot more separate than it really was. I did quite a lot of theatre stuff at school as a teenager and loved it. And as I'm sure we would all attest, it's not a proper career when you're that child, and that's what your career teachers tell you, and you think that's. So I was like, oh, it's fine. I can go to university. I can be an engineer, and I can make lighting desks, because then I can stay in the theatre. And so I got to university, and I discovered that engineering is actually maths, and it's nothing like as creative and interesting as I thought it was going to be. So I sat through an awful lot of math lectures, and I slept through an awful lot of math lectures, if I'm completely honest. And me and my tutor didn't really see eye to eye about the amount of theatre that I did while I was there. but still, sort of throughout my whole 4 years of that degree, I thought I sort of couldn't quite get out of this mindset that I knew I didn't want to be an engineer, but I also, theatre wasn't a proper career that I was going to go into and have a career out of. But I got to the end of the 4 years and I couldn't really, like everybody else always says, I couldn't really imagine doing anything else, think about doing anything else. And that's where the Motley link came in for me. Somebody else who I knew at university told me about Motley. I didn't know anything about it before then. So I looked them up, and I saw that their deadline for applications for the next year's course had passed. And I thought, oh, that's a shame. But I wrote to them anyway. And I said, this looks, a really interesting course. I'd like to hear a bit more. And they said, well, apply anyway. And I thought, well, that's somebody after my own heart. That's the way that I can get on board with somebody who says that doesn't matter. So I went down and I had an interview there, and it was just an amazing place. So it just sort of followed through. But it was an entirely design-based course. There was no lighting sort of side to it at all. So I'm technically untrained in lighting as well. Apart from having spent, like you, Joe, an awful long time getting it wrong and figuring out what you then need to do to get it right.
And for you, Joe, how did that process work? So you say being fascinated by seeing people kind of work theatre, I suppose, to start with. Did the design come, or did the interest in the design come at the same time? Or was it something that followed on when you got to know the workings behind that sort of visual aspect of it?
Well, I suppose I'd always been designing, because even when I was doing the amateur dramatics, before I left school, I was designing the lighting for those productions. But I really liked being in a building, and I really liked working with people and teams and seeing how to do the craft, really, I suppose, and how to make productions. So theatre and a theatre building really appealed to me, and I just didn't want to be outside of that community of people. And I just like making a show, and every night the lights going up and operating it, and seeing the audiences come in. That whole buzz of a show happening every night, I think, is what kept me in producing theatre for so long. And then it got to a point, so all the way I did a couple of professional shows when I was 18, 19, when I was an apprentice at the Royal Exchange Theatre. I did a couple of their smaller studio productions, and went, and I got some good training from that, and I worked with some amazing lighting designers to watch lighting. So I really enjoyed doing the lighting designs as well. And then I got, when I went to Liverpool Playhouse as head of lighting, you had to light every single show. So that was a real training ground of just getting on with it, because I lit every show in the main house and in the studio. So within a season, I'd be doing nearly a dozen shows, which was just fantastic. And then at the court, I came to London and went to the Royal Court, partly to see whether my lighting was any good, but the Royal Court didn't employ lighting designers. They employed you as a technician. So I went and started getting freelance work. And while I was at the Royal Court and being a lighting designer, I was just working constantly. And at some point I had to decide whether I was going to just stay within producing theatre or be a lighting designer. And I thought, well, I've been doing that for 30 years, so it'd be really good to just spend a part of my career just being a lighting designer. And that's what made me make that move. It's nice to know that I earned a living being a lighting designer as well as a theatre technician.
And so if we look at it from the other side, what do you guys think what do you think kind of audiences see in lighting? What is the importance on the other side? You've spoken about your passions and why it's important to you, but what drives that passion from an audience's perspective, in your opinion?
I've heard a lot, or at least when I was starting out, that kind of the best review is no review, especially if you're doing kind of drama, I guess, or kind of straight theatre. It's that thing where you kind of it's a bit like cinematography, and you're making sure that the audience is always looking at the most important thing and is always getting the kind of right emotion and kind of level of tension. And it's never in isolation. You're always working with the sound design, the actors, the sets, the overall direction. It's a really hard thing to kind of distill it into, this is what the lighting does and this is what everything else does. It's about supporting that mood and that narrative and that character and that journey, so that the audience can really get immersed in it.
Perhaps not sort of the most glamorous term for it, but I often think of it as sort of slightly the glue that holds all of those bits together in a way. It's its own thing in its own right, and it adds an awful lot in its own right, but it also is sort of falls across everything and helps to tie everything together, really. That's a really important part of it.
I'd agree. I think it's a total collaboration, because we can all light a black box with lots of lights flashing and banging and being decorative, but if it doesn't work with the music or the performance or the sound or the scenery, then it's just a clash of ideas put together, where a subtle shift that a member of the audience doesn't see, where you're shifting a color palette to make the scene angry, only works if the acting is as good as you work together with the acting or the soundscape to make the audience sucked into that very subtle piece of lighting, which they have no idea is there. But if the actors are not getting it right, or really showing the same emotion as you are, or you're shifting the wrong emotion, then it doesn't work together. And that's the same for a big dramatic rock and rolly type piece, or a pantomime, down to a small piece of delicate theatre in, say, Jermyn Street.
And does that affect the way that you each interact with the process of the making of the theatre? Do you find it really beneficial to be there at the very, very beginning, to be involved in those discussions that would normally be like just a writer or director discussions? Does it really aid your process to be there at the very, very initial stage, such that you're having that integral creative contribution to the piece?
Yes. It does, but I think it does it in two ways. I think it's really important to be involved in the conversation, because the lighting brings something that the other elements don't, and it also does this thing where it joins the other elements together, and everything has to work sort of in wonderful harmony together, of course. So from that point of view, it's really useful to be there at the beginning. But I think it's also really important to remember that it's a creative process. The whole thing is a creative process. And actually, it's really important that everybody who is making a contribution to that creative process is involved in the whole of that creative process. And so I think there's sort of two parts to why it's important to be there at the beginning. Firstly, for the act of creation, but secondly, so that you don't sort of feel like you're joining something that everybody else has made all the decisions on. And then you're sort of coming in and your job is simply to realize what they've already figured out. I think that's really true, that sort of it's both parts of that.
And so where do you guys start with in that creative process? What is your initial cue? Is it emotional? Is it to do with something visual? Is it to do with colour? Is it to do with the script itself? Where do you guys begin to start?
It really depends on the piece and the team a lot of the time. So there's some shows that I would do that I'd be involved really early. So there's one director who brings me early drafts of scripts that she's not even had programmed yet, and we talk through a script. Or kind of dance pieces where you kind of have to wait till you're in the room because there's not really much else to go on unless they've already got the music sorted. If it's something like a Jermyn Street play, the first thing I'll often get is either the script or an outline. So I'll start with that and work through it, read it a few times, do a bit of research around it, and kind of break it down into units or scenes or shifts and things. And then hopefully you'd have a conversation with the director, with or without the designer, fairly quickly off the back of that, and it all kind of rolls on from there.
I mean, I mainly concentrate in drama and opera, so I usually start with a script, and before I'll accept a piece of work, I'll want to read the script and feel emotionally attached to that work. And I'll once I'm employed, the first thing I'll do before going into any meetings is read the script again. And I have quite a strange process, which is I see a lot of things in colour. So I'll make notes in the margin about different colours I'm feeling, and it, you know, red doesn't necessarily mean anger or blue sadness. It's never the same in the same. It's never the same colours, but I'll make notes all the way down, and then those colours get translated again into a language and into a cue sheet, and then once I've seen some rehearsals and I've started formulating a cue sheet from all the discussions, that's when the technical side of it and the decision making happens for me much later. But it's sometimes quite interesting when I look back at my script as I'm actually lighting the show in the venue, that how the colour is on stage is being produced, and that actually it relates back to a note in my margin, and it's gone through a whole process, and I've not really followed that through, but then there I am again with the same two things from the very start to the end.
There's a real parallel that I see in my set design work, particularly to what you were just saying, Joe, about sort of going back to noticing your sort of original feelings about things. I notice it much more in set design than I do in my lighting, but you have a very early initial idea about something, and then you sort of feel you have to go and try all sorts of other options just to make sure that you're sort of thinking it right, and you sort of get really stuck and you think, oh no, none of this is working, and then you realize that actually your first idea was bang on. so often it is, and I think that I really noticed that you sort of so frequently you end up going round and round the houses right back to exactly where you started. Your very first impression.
So I suppose that raises the interesting question. I had a good chat with some sound designers the other week, and they were talking a lot about how their work is informed a lot by the audience's expectation of what a sound should sound like, which is often distant from what a sound actually sounds like. You know, a gunshot should sound like this because we think it has done in film, or in we've watched radio plays or whatever, and that's what it sounds like, so we've got to replicate that sound. And it's not necessarily a gun, it might be a stapler or something. So does that sort of thing happen in that same way that Will and Joe, you've both spoken about this maybe instinctive kind of reaction to something? Is that a feeling that you have to unpick and apply it to what you think audiences are going to expect from the work? Do you have to think about that sort of how audiences see things a lot? And do you find that interrogation a part of any of your processes?
I don't really think about what the audience think about it. If I'll take a set design of a natural room and I will create it to do what I feel feels instinctively right to make that room. I don't worry about whether the audience question that. As long as I feel I've created the light coming into the room correctly, that's what I worry about. Having said that, I also play with, because I love colour, I never do anything totally naturalistically anyway. So everything shifts one notch one way or the other, depending what emotion I want to get out. So what I care about with the audience is what they're emotionally feeling to the show, rather than the reality.
Yeah, I think it's a lot about gesture as well. Like, an audience will never go to see a play and expect it to look realistic. Even if it's a naturalistic set, it's still, it's never realistic. There's still missing a wall, essentially. So there's a lot more freedom there, and it's about playing with those contrasts. As you were saying, Joe, you can make a naturalistic set feel very different and feel very abstract just by shifting that colour. And if the audience sits in one thing for a long time, they'll start to get used to it and they won't really notice it until it shifts back. I had a really fun time on a contemporary dance piece I did recently, which is, it's great if you want to play because there's just so many fewer rules than in kind of theatre. And we had a white floor and these kind of maroon costumes, and the first 15 minutes, I think, of a kind of 25-minute piece, I lit them all in this kind of bluey green, so you couldn't tell what colour they were wearing. But because it was just there the whole time, you got so used to it. And then at one point the music changed and their movement changed, and suddenly the whole place was white, and you suddenly realised that you'd even forgotten to think about what they were wearing. And it was just that really fun thing to see how long you could sit in something until you took it for granted, and then to change it. I mean, you'd never get away with that in theatre, or you'd have to be really bold and really brave get your director on side. But it was quite a fun experiment.
And what's that part of the process like when you come to kind of like a preview stage, I presume, and does your lighting design ever change at that period? Is it ever expected to change by other people? And how much of, like, before you get into a space, how much of your design has to be informed by, I presume there's a lot to do with like a single viewpoint and multiple viewpoints in theatre. Do you have to take that into design quite a lot in terms of where people are seeing, where audiences are seeing the stage from?
Definitely. One of my favourite things to do in any venue that's not just end on is you'll do tech usually from one table, often the best seat in the house. And then I love on either the dress rehearsal or one of the first previews is to just go and sit in a completely different seat where I might have popped in to have a look during tech, but and often I'll like it more from seeing it from a different perspective, partly just because I haven't been, bashing myself over the head with the same image the whole time. It's something new, but often I'll watch it from, round the corner and just think it looks so much more interesting.
I don't think you ever finish. You're never completed. I don't think there's a light designer out there who walks away even at press night and thinks they've finished, because there's so much you can play with. And I don't mean that. I mean, sometimes I walk away hoping that I'm feeling very pleased with it, but it never feels over. But talking about working from different perspectives, for an audience point of view, I do a lot of work in the round and in thrust, and I have to think about everybody in that 3D, because that in the round you have to light from 4 sides, and what somebody else's front light is another member of the audience's backlight, and it's playing with those ideas of where light's coming from, and making sure that the actor feels completely real. Because if you liked using a term general cover to sort of illuminate the face from all 4 sides, of course the figure becomes boring. So you have to allow the moonlight to come from one side, and for that to look different to the light coming from the other side of the actor, and you have to be able to shift that around the space. So it's you do then go and sit in all the different seats in the round in order to make sure that the balance is right, but the balance should never be boring, because it has to feel real, for a better word.
That's fascinating. And I suppose maybe we could end by talking a little bit about kind of the sort of the technical side of lighting design in terms of the actual lights and stuff. So Will, you're the artistic director of Meta Theatre, aren't you? And you do a lot of work promoting sustainability in theatre. And so it might be interesting to talk a little bit about kind of the practical, what are lights in theatre, and what do they mean, and how sustainable are they, and those sorts of questions.
We could be here for days. So on a very basic level, historically, lights have been very similar to what we used to have in our homes. They were a tungsten light bulb. They were extremely inefficient. Over the years, they have improved, and the lenses and the optics inside the black metal boxes that the bulb is put with reflectors and lenses and bits to shape where the light can go have improved, and the efficiency of them has gone up and up. But those light bulbs are inherently not terribly efficient electrically, turning the electrical energy into the light that we actually want to use. And their days are limited. I think we all have to admit that at some point they will be gone, just like we no longer have incandescent light bulbs in our houses. They're not sold anymore. We're not allowed to buy them. And there have been over the last, I can't remember how long, but over a couple of attempts over the last few years by the EU to ban the bulbs that we use in traditional existing theatre lights. And there's two sort of parts to that conversation. The sort of interesting things about that. One is that actually the quality of that light is completely different to what any other technology of light can produce, and it's a quality of light that we're all really used to, and we as lighting designers know really well how to use because we've had loads of experience using it, and we love to use it, and it looks very good on people's skin, and we really enjoy that. And so there was a huge backlash the last time round, both times when the EU tried to get rid of these bulbs. Also, of course, because actually all of the small theatres, even all the big theatres, to be honest, still use an awful lot of these lights. And if you can't buy the bulbs anymore, then suddenly the metal boxes are no use and they've got to go in the bin, and that seems like a huge waste. All of the embodied carbon in those units is gone. So that's a real shame. But I guess there's a part of me that also thinks that's what we're used to, and things have to change, and we have to figure out how to, we all have to get used to what works and what doesn't work with the other technologies and start sort of trying to embrace them a bit more. And the more we embrace them, the quicker and the better they will get, as manufacturers realize what it is we want out of them and figure out how to do that technically. So there will be, I think, a really challenging period, crossover period for us as designers, where we can no longer use very much or very many of these existing things that we want to use, and the new things haven't really matched what we want from them yet. And for what I do, there are a few of these new LED lights out there that do pretty much what I want them to be able to do. But I'd be really lucky if very many of the productions that I get to work on could afford very many of them, because they're still really expensive because they're quite new comparatively. So there will, obviously there will come a point where that's what everybody uses, because we can no longer get the old things and they're much cheaper and in many ways bring on that day, and that will be great, but we're not there yet. So at the moment, sort of in that respect, we're sort of stuck at a point where there are some things that some cheap LED lights do really well, and we, in my opinion, we sort of all ought to be trying to use them for those things as much as we can, because that will sort of start getting them out there and getting the manufacturers working on improving them and stuff. But while we need something else to do something else, we've still got it there, and we should use that for that, and just sort of try and be a bit conscious of what we're doing and why, and sort of keeping the conversation going about that, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's a subject close to my heart that I could talk about for days. But I think that's sort of the gist of that it will be changing, and we have to sort of go with, as designers, we have to go with that change. But we also don't want to jump the gun and get there too quickly and have to use stuff that actually doesn't really do the job that we want it to do.
I'm really sorry to see the loss of tungsten. I'm a great advocate of LED, and I love it. I think it has its place, and I think there's really good LED out there that's incredibly exciting, and every theatre should have at least 50% of it in their stock, because it makes us far more creative and gives us far, is fantastic to use and gives us lots of ideas, and we can work with different colour skin tones and materials all the time, and we don't have to worry about there not being enough lights to do all those sort of things. So they're absolutely fantastic, but they're not as efficient as they should be. You put a rig up, and I have a spot that I want to do one effect with, and once it's done that effect for 30 seconds, it is never going to be on again. Now, if you're an LED light, you're pulling power for the whole of the evening's performance. And often that power will be more than the power of the tungsten light that has been on and off for 30 seconds. And there's a huge ethical problem about the kit is all run by electronics. The LED is mined. most of it is dirty, so has to be disposed of cleanly. And technology means that we want to constantly have the best bit of LED kit out there, so stuff gets thrown away and disposed of. Where a lot, a profile light can last for 30 or 40 years. A tungsten profile light.
And the only thing you replace is the bulb, isn't it? Yeah, no, that's really true.
Yeah, I mean, I regularly fix up lights that are older than me. Like, whenever we do maintenance at one of the theatres I work at, it's, you're sat there and it's like, yeah, this thing was made before I was even thought of, and it still works, and all you do is replace the bulb every couple of years sometimes.
And that bulb biodegrades back into the ground. It's tungsten and it's a bit of glass. It has no toxicity about it whatsoever. The biggest problem is that we have to abide by the same regulations of factories and industry, and that's the big problem. But we don't use our 2K tungsten light in the same way as a factory does, having it on 24 hours a day. We have it
exactly
a few hours, if at the most. But I would love to see all the things that eat up a lot of power, like site lighting, big backlights, moving, all those things that really do chunk out power on every production, hour after hour after hour. They should all be LED, but we should have beautiful little tungsten things to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
But that's my...
One thing I have been discovering with LED a lot, actually watching a lot of the kind of online theatre that's being broadcast now, and I did a kind of theatre for film project earlier this year, and it's extremely difficult on film to match the quality and the colour of LED and tungsten. So if you're using both sources, if you've got some fluorescent or arc source thrown in there as well, it's really hard to mix them and match them on camera. So it's been quite fun often watching the National Theatre productions and seeing, there's a site lit, and just being like, well, that's not the colour they meant it to be, and trying to guess what colour they meant it to be, because if you match it beautifully on the skin, there was one piece that had a flame, live flame, some tungsten light coming in, which I'm assuming had been colour matched but looked white, and then the background looked pink, but I'm assuming that live on stage everything would have colour matched beautifully to create this big fiery atmosphere. But as soon as you film it, the way that the camera picks up the different light sources is just it's really shocking how in kind of bringing in those different light sources is actually setting us back in other technologies, because it suddenly makes theatre for film that's so much more challenging for the people filming it, and the lighting designers desperately trying to adapt their lighting for a single film performance to make it look as good as it possibly can.
Is that something you guys have to consider?
Very difficult.
Have you been in those situations of having to provide lighting for film as well in terms of film theatre?
Yeah, I came a cropper on it recently. I did a piece that was made as a piece of theatre, but it was always going to be filmed, and I had LED lighting, a backdrop, and because we were all in the studio, I ended up changing the colours and shifting them, just doing it off the camera, and then I'd look up and kind of see what it actually looked like in real life, and it was really shocking. And then we had production photos taken by a theatre photographer, a really good photographer, and obviously those colours came out on his camera as they looked to the naked eye close enough. So the production photos and the film just completely, the production photos looked bright blue and the film was this gorgeous kind of white grey, which is what I was aiming for. But in order to get that, we had to shift it to like this kind of weird blue colour to get it to match. So it was an absolute headache. Really good experience, but it's just a different way of thinking, because you can't trust your eyes anymore.
The other thing I've really noticed with filming things is that you have to, it's partly colour and it's partly sort of those kind of qualities of light, but it's also about shadow and contrast. And I love really high contrast in sort of live lighting that I'm working with, and lots of shadow. I'm really interested in what shadow does and makes the space feel like. And then you put it all in front of a camera and suddenly everything is sort of black and blurry. And one person's face is super bright and it all looks really terrible in every direction. And you find that the only way to solve that is just to wash out for your eye, wash out all these shadows, and you watch it in real life and it's really flat and boring. And then you see it on the film and you get what you were thinking of in real life in that way. I guess the other thing that I really noticed is that those shadows, partly you get to use that interesting effect, but also partly the naked eye is quite forgiving of sort of inconsistency in a way that camera isn't. I did a prom last year where I was lighting it for the audience in the Albert Hall, and there was a TV lighting director lighting it for the cameras. And so I did the way that we worked it was I did my lighting session to light the live show, and then he and I sort of sat next to him to make sure he wasn't doing anything that sort of went against what I was thinking, but he was fixing it all for the camera, and he had to do loads of work to even everything out, and stuff that I hadn't even noticed, that they were going slightly brighter and darker as they walked across the stage, and he was, he had all his cameras and was sort of looking at it all and was able to spot all of these things that I just hadn't clocked at all, because the camera doesn't sort of let you get away with that.
Yeah, I had a show that was being made just as we were getting locked down. So we were in tech, so they brought a camera crew in to film it in order to try and recoup all the work that we'd done somehow. And it was literally, we had the Thursday afternoon to record it before we all had to get home. And they just came in, we did a dress rehearsal, 4 cameras, off we go. And an actor spent most of his time in this dirty white chair, but would get up from the chair and wander around. And as a member of the audience, your eye accepts or he's now moving somewhere else, or your focus is pulled somewhere else, and you forget about the chair. But the camera was totally unforgiving to this white chair that just kept going, whoop, whoop, look at me. Not change its iris in order to move with the actor, which, I mean, we had cues to take the chair up and down, but only for the audience's eye, because we had no idea we were going to be filming it. And it just that, we'd have had to have taken it completely out in order for the camera to have adjusted, but we only had a one go filming at it. So there's this play out there with this very bright white chair in it.
That's it for another episode of Prompt Corner. Thanks for tuning in. Next week, we'll be talking to people who are alone on stage. In the meantime, why not follow our social media channels, and you can catch up with all the episodes of Prompt Corner on our YouTube channel as well. Until next time.